Image copyright Uchennivu Kanu Uchennivu Image caption Equally Harcourt White often tried to conceal his deformed fingers in our series of letters from African journalists. Novelist and writer Adeobi Trishina Wabani writes about the Nigerian man who composed some 200 hymns, despite having leprosy. Nigeria's most famous victim of leprosy was fatally injured in a motor accident 40 years ago, and a ceremony is being held to mark the anniversary of the composer's death. Born in 1905, Equally Harcourt White was diagnosed with leprosy as a teenager, at a time when there was no effective cure for the dreaded disease which usually leads to deformity of the hands and feet. People suffering from leprosy were often isolated or driven away from their communities. White channeled his experience of suffering and stigmatization into, and went on to compose more than 200 inspirational hymns. He wrote with the stubs of his thumb and index finger, said 77-year-old Uchennivu Kanu Uchennivu, a professor of who was a friend and protege of White. He wrote very slowly. It took him a whole day or more to write one page of Who was Equally Harcourt White. Image copyright Somiari Harcourt, born in Abanima, Rivers State of Nigeria in 1905, diagnosed with leprosy in 1919 inmate at the Uzuakali leprosy colony in southeastern Nigeria from 1932. Despite being cured in 1945, composed over 200 hymns, mostly in the Igbo language, set up a choir made up of people living with leprosy, who toured Nigeria. His choir sang for British dignitaries who visited colonial Nigeria, included Equally, a traditional name in his birth name, so as to not be mistaken for a foreigner. Died in a motor accident in 1977. Listen to his hymn Achala Egwu. White's talent for was developed at the Uzuakali Leprosy Center in what is now Abia State in southeastern Nigeria, where he spent the last 45 years of his life. Before then, he had been receiving treatment at a hospital in Port Harcourt, capital city of his home state of Rivers in the Niger Delta, which had a thriving leprosy ward. When residents of Port Harcourt, known as the Garden City, agitated for the removal of the lepers in their midst, White led the other patients to resist attempts by local authorities to evacuate them for sea, insisting that they be provided with an alternative location instead. Cured, but still in the colony, his persistent activism partly led to the intervention of Methodist missionaries, who then established the Uzuakali Leprosy Center in 1932, with White and his fellow patients as some of the first set of inmates. The work at Uzuakali was hugely significant, said John Manton, Irish historian and anthropologist of medicine. Image copyright John Manton. Image caption Equally Harcourt White's CDs are on sale in Nigeria. It was the place where the dosage of dapsone for treating of leprosy was standardized in the early 1950s, and the first clinical trials of clofazimine took place there in the early 1960s. These are two of the drugs that are used as part of multi-drug therapy for leprosy today. It was also in Uzuakali that White met British missionary and medical doctor Thomas Frank Davy, a lover and a pianist, an association that became the catalyst for his career. Dr. Davy taught him everything he knew about that he acquired by studying the Methodist hymn book, said Mr. Uchennivu. During trips to surrounding and remote villages to treat leprosy patients, Dr. Davy recorded the traditional of the people. He then encouraged White to develop his own personal style by listening to and composing that read more like those tunes, rather than the ones in the Methodist hymn book. Even after White was eventually declared cured of leprosy in 1949, he chose to remain at the Uzuakali Center, where he formed a choir made up of other patients. His first wife, who also had leprosy, had abandoned him there a few years earlier after she was cured, leaving him with their 2 children. Aura of Hope. Soon, books of White's hymns were being sold in different churches across the region, and choirs from around Nigeria were visiting the leprosy center to listen to and learn from him. Tales abound of the reach and impact of his, most of which was written in his local Igbo language and focused on hope in spite of trials and tribulations. In the evenings, people from all walks of life came and he would teach them the which God had shown him in dreams, said Enima Okaroafor. Now in his 70s, Mr. Okaroafor is currently the oldest resident at the Uzuakali Center, having been diagnosed with leprosy as a child and abandoned by his family. Image copyright John Manton. Image caption White's grave lies at the Uzuakali Chapel of Hope. At the time, because of his fame, we regarded him as the most senior person here and gave him that honor and respect. Because of what he was doing, he moved with many important men. The decision to change the name of the chapel at the Leprosy Center from Colony Chapel to Chapel of Hope was inspired by the aura that pervaded the hall whenever White and the choir rendered his. He didn't want instruments with his so that they wouldn't overshadow the message, said 85-year-old Godwin Harcourt, White's oldest child. From his you could get solace, advice, things that would awaken your hope in God. Godwin grew up in the leper colony with his father, although living in separate quarters, and became a school teacher. Every school I was sent to, I made sure I formed a choir there so I could teach his he said. Apart from church services, White's choir sang for various dignitaries from Britain who visited colonial Nigeria. Some say that the Queen of England also became aware of his, and once requested his hymns to be played by the BBC on Christmas Day. And during the Nigerian Civil War, when leaders of the Igbo ethnic group attempted to secede and form a different country called Biafra, White's were popular as a source of courage and hope. Singing with lepers each time we gathered, the chances were that we would end up with some recording of his, said Ejikeago, 73, who fought in the Biafran army. It is not only the Biafran soldiers alone. The Christians, each time we gathered, had his recordings playing. Biafra at a glance. Image caption. IPOB claims these existing states would make up an independent Biafra. First Republic of Biafra was declared by Nigerian military officer Odumegwu Ojukwu in 1967. He led his mainly ethnic Igbo forces into a deadly three-year civil war that ended in 1970. More than 1 million people lost their lives, mostly because of hunger. Decades after Biafra uprising was quelled by the military, secessionist groups have attracted the support of many young people. They feel Nigeria's central government is not investing in the region, but the government say their complaints are not particular to the southeast. He was always going on tour with his choir, said White's grandson, Somiari Harcourt, a 50-year-old medical doctor who spent some of his childhood years living with the composer. I did not appreciate his until I became older, then the began to make sense. I became amazed that someone could write so much with limited education. I was breaking bounds to go to the leprosy colony to listen to to sing with his choir, said Mr. Achenivu. My family were afraid that I would catch leprosy, but I still went. I had no fear. The force was so strong. White was also invited to teach his in schools. It was while teaching at the nearby Methodist Boys High School in Uzuakoli that his and Mr. Achenivu's paths first crossed in the early 1950s. The secondary school invited him to teach his to the school choir, and I was a member, and he discovered that I was talented, and Mr. Achenivu said, whenever he didn't come, he handed over to me, and that was my beginning to conduct choirs. Mr. Achenivu's family were horrified when he informed them that he had changed his mind about studying medicine, deciding to study instead. They refused. And then, White paid a visit to his family home. Image copyright Achenivu Kanu. Achenivu. Image caption. Achenivu Kanu. Achenivu occupied the Harcourt White Chair in Coral at the University of Port Harcourt. It was rare for the to leave the leper colony and pay personal visits, so people ran out to catch a glimpse of him when he arrived, Mr. Achenivu recalls. White declined the eager efforts of Mr. Achenivu's mother to play hostess. He had come for a single purpose. He told them, allow my son, Achenivu, to study that he wants to study. Who knows, he may be the one to tell the world about me and my. That heartfelt statement not only succeeded in persuading Mr. Achenivu's family, it also proved prophetic. Since 2012, he has occupied the Harcourt White Chair in Coral at the University of Port Harcourt. We can't present lepers to the world. 4 years after White's death, renowned Nigerian playwright, Ola Rotimi, was commissioned to produce a play for Nigeria's 21st Independence Day anniversary on the 1st of October 1981. He chose to base it on the life of White and approached Mr. Achenivu, who offered him his thesis for all the information he might need. Mr. Rotimi then asked Mr. Achenivu to provide for the production, titled Hopes of the Living Dead. The professor assembled a choir that worked hard to learn dozens of White's. But when they traveled from southeast Nigeria to the then capital city of Lagos to attend rehearsals a few weeks ahead of the big day, a director at the Nigerian Ministry of Culture was not impressed with Mr. Rotimi's plans. Adeobi Trishan Awabani. Image copyrighted Adeobi Trishan Awabani. It was rare for the equally Harcourt White to leave the leper colony and pay personal visits, so people ran out to catch a glimpse of him when he arrived. He said that we couldn't be presenting lepers to the world on Nigeria's 21st independence anniversary, Mr. Achenivu said. And the national performance was cancelled. Hopes of the Living Dead was eventually staged in some school theaters. Equally Harcourt White had lessons to teach Nigeria, Mr. Achenivu said. Simplicity, humility, service, courage. The management of the Uzuakoli Leprosy Center hopes that the 40th anniversary of White's death, taking place on 25 and the 26th of November at the Chapel of Hope where his grave lies, will revive interest in his life and work attract more support for their effort to educate the public on leprosy. The disease is now completely curable, detecting symptoms early prevents deformity, and there is no longer any need to stigmatize or isolate sufferers. The man in the center seemed to have been forgotten by people, said Joshua Okpara, a Methodist priest and project director of the center. It is a story that needs to rise again. We saw the need to revive people's minds back to his contributions. It is necessary for people to start looking towards his impact and also to help. More from Letters from Africa. Parenting styles gonna be the U.S. street lawyers dispense instant justice. Why Metu wants stop Sudan's UAL predators. Why Nigeria is failing teachers and pupils. Follow us on Twitter at BBC Africa, on Facebook at BBC Africa and on Instagram at BBC Africa.